4 दिन लेट 4 लेट हैं तो पूरी ये 2 अवधियां ने टाई कटी इसलिए एप्लीकेशन मिलती है तो कोई असर नहीं होगा एक साल से 2 साल नहीं करेंगे
Namaskar, hearty welcome to the 14th session of BIMSTEC Literary Festival being organizing by Sahitya Academy and the Foundation of Sark Writers and Literature, that is FOSPOL. And this session is being dedicated to paper presentation, and each participant is being allotted with 15 minutes. And this session is going to be chaired by none other than Professor Manjurul Islamji from Bangladesh. And in this session, we have 4 papers. First by Gurbet Singh Guriaji from India, followed by Rakshanda Jalil from India. He's yet to join, I think. Miss Kamala Vijratreji from Sri Lanka, and we have Syed Manjurul Islamji from Bangladesh. Now, may I request the chair of today's session, Syed Manjurul Islamji, to kindly take over the charge of this.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Although we have a general theme in which we talk about giving and taking among us, we talk about creating a situation where everyone contributes for building peace, mutual understanding, and tolerance. The spirit of FOSPOL is always being together and doing things together, creatively and otherwise, so that the benefits of our activities, be them literary or in any other sphere, go to the people of the countries we represent. And in this FOSPOL conferences, when we were there in person for several times, we felt that when we were together, we forgot about our borders. We belong to the same community of people who felt and thought in the same way. We did not allow our differences to come and cloud our minds. We always fostered a sense of togetherness because we are historically, geographically, and culturally thrown into a topography in which everyone has to survive together. And with the climate change looming, we just cannot draw borders over our rivers and ecosystems, because one country's problems today travel to the next country without any visa or passport. So in our literature, we talk about all these spirits of humanity, inclusivity, and how to give space for everyone, including women, children, and people from marginalized communities. In FOSPOL conferences, everyone has the same chair. We sit together, one next to the other, and we allow the spirit of friendship to develop. We listen to songs and music. When in Delhi, we meet artists. I always steal at least half an hour from my schedule to meet Arpana Kaurji, one of the most famous painters of our time. And it's so heartening when you meet her and meet Ajit Kaurji. And that's the reason I was hoping that this conference would be in person, but she has assured me that in March, we shall be meeting, hopefully, and let's keep our fingers crossed, in person. And that would be a celebration after COVID and the unnecessary war which is raging in Europe. Probably we will celebrate humanity coming together and set an example to the world. Now, I'm so delighted that we have some speakers today. One is very young, Gurbet Singh Gauravaji. How are you doing today, sir? You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And you set the ball rolling for this 1 hour conference.
Okay.
And you have to speak within 15 minutes or maybe ideally 13, 14 minutes so that we can leave at least 1 or 2 minutes for those who really demand them. So please go ahead and read your paper or speak straight into the screen. We allow both. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. First of all, I would like to share my views that today is Guru Purab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and I congratulate all who are hearing this and all on the earth that the happy Guru Purab. It's just a matter of point that we are having today Guru Purab also. Thanks. It's again a privilege for me to share my views, and I really thanks to BP Ajit Kaur ji who gave me the opportunity to present my paper. I'm audible properly, sir?
Yeah, absolutely
Exactly.
fine.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. My views are on our ancient literature, that is our literature, ancient and the contemporary. May I start, sir?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. The literature from the Latin litera means the letters are referring to the written word, which is written work of a specific culture, subculture, religion, philosophy, or the study of such work, which may appear in poetry or in prose. The literature is the torch bearer that has helped the civilization to overcome the darkness. And in absence of great Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Vedas, India would not have been called the golden bird when we call it the Sone di Chidiya. Similarly, what makes the Greece the mother of civilization is the great literature. So I mean to say that the literature unites the mankind. So when we talk about the Asian literature that comprises religious and the scientific documents, tales, poetry, plays, old edicts and the declarations and other forms of writing that were recorded on variety of media, including stone tablets, palm leaves, and metal, etc. So the word contemporary means living belongings to are occurring in the present. So when we talk about our contemporary, we are talking about the literature that is being written in now, about, and now. But that does not the now encompass. So the contemporary literature, some says the literature written after the World War II through the country, while some have the disagreement to this definition. But the works of the contemporary literature reflects a society's social or the political viewpoints shown through realistic characters, connections to the current events, and socio-economic messages. So when we think of the contemporary literature, we cannot say simply look at the few themes or settings. Since society changes over time, so do the content and message of this writing. The modern literature and the contemporary literature are two overlapping paths. And we must not have any confusion of the two terms, that is the modern literature and the contemporary literature. Although both may refer to the same in a general sense, there is a difference between the both. The modern literature refers to the literature dating from the late 19th century to the 1960, while the contemporary literature refers to the literature dating from the Second World War to the present. So these two terms are, I think, they are the clear, and the work in contemporary literature mainly includes believable stories with a base in the reality. The characters are strong and believable while the setting is modern era. Moreover, stories in contemporary literature are considered to be more character-driven than plot-driven. Some genres of this period include flash fiction, slam poetry, memoirs, autobiographies, novel, and stories. But so before delving deeply into the exceedingly diversified genre of the contemporary literature, it is important to understand the term modernity, and the modernization in the Indian context. These three terms in the modern context are quite significant. However, the more significant aspect of modernity is a value-based approach. The particular attitudes and the ideas are convinced more progressive, and hence it is natural to condition them as modern as opposed to what existed before. The Indian context, temporarily literature, bears an essential relation with the social and the political history of the country during the mid-19th century, which indeed marked a breakthrough. English education had gradually disseminated in India during the first half of the 19th century, but its effect is seen manifestly in the Indian literature. A new approach toward the literature had emerged in the major languages. So, when we talk about the modern Indian writers, that is reflected in the Indianized English, be it Salman Rushdie, Shashi Tharoor, or Amit Ghosh, the disconstruction of the British Empire was quite evident. The regional language is very freely used in the prose, but thus once again, the breaking, the reconstructing, the adding the new twist and the dimension to the traditional narrative patterns. Hindi, Gujarati, Bengali, Punjabi, Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Marathi writers adhere to the modern and postmodern idiom of writing. For instance, Mulk Raj Anand's works is replete with Hindi and Punjabi words like ha, na, salam, hazur, shabash, and most path-breaking is now, that is Arundhati Rao's, when she uses the word in her classic, The God of Small Things, like Chako Sarbanu, etc. So I mean to say, when we talk about all these things, the impact of the Indian tradition of Indian soil also seems there. Now coming to the contemporary Indian regional literature. Besides the Indian English literature, the regional literature of the subcontinent reflected significant changes as well. In the Indian languages, also the cinema had a tremendous impact on contemporary film industry. Similar developments were also witnessed in the South Indian literature and in their circles. In the 19th century, the South Indian literature was inspired by European, but in the end of the century, things started change to help the modern writers. So the Indian contemporary writers like Dharamveer Bharti, Mulk Raj Anand, Arundhati Rai, Vikram Seth, Jhumpa Lahiri, Amit Ghosh have won international awards and put Indian firmly on the world's literary map. The two famous names are the Mumbai-born Salman Rushdie, who received the Booker Prize for his Midnight Children, and Kerala author Arundhati Rai, who also bagged the Booker for her Gold of Small Things. Other important writers are Shashi Deshpande and some others. The Indian contemporary literature in its scope of the various genres and styles, and the contemporary literature in India is influenced considerably in the content by the Western philosophy and thought. So these are the aspects broadly which we can discuss about when we just talk about the philosophy, the base, and the content of the literature. Now I am, because being a Punjabi, and as Madam Ajit Kaur feels it, that some points or some aspects or some otherwise influences for the Punjabi literature may also be involved while presenting this paper. Now I am coming to the Punjabi language. There is a long tradition of Punjabi literature which goes back to the period of North India vernacular, which later developed in the various modern provincial languages in the 8th century or earlier, with Sanskrit and Pali literature before it. Some of the scholars think that the modern Punjabi developed from Multani. Some of the sloks, as founded in Sri Guru Granth Sahib, are pure in Multani dialect of that period. Some of the poetical forms popular during that period were slok, shand, svai, kabit, sohile, bar, etc. The three traditions are marked in Punjabi literature up to the end of the 19th century. The Sikh religious tradition, popularly known as Gurmat tradition, is based on the poetry of Sikh Gurus, as the same is in the Guru Granth Sahib, the holy book of the Sikhs. The Sufi tradition, that is the second tradition of literature and thought, has been an equally dominant component of the Punjabi literature, traditions, and culture. Sheikh Farid, whose poetry is contained in Guru Granth Sahib, makes the beginning of this tradition. But it's the super poetry and case the Punjabi language, mainly of Bulle Shah and Shah Hussain, which is responsible for making it popular, most powerful tradition of Punjabi writing and singing. Then there is the third tradition of Kissa poetry, singing tales of love and romance. The first available Kissa in Punjabi is by the mother on the popular folk narrative of Heer, written in the local dialect of Chang. The Kissa poetry reached its peak of glory with Waris Shah's Heer, which continues to be one of the most popular literary composition in the Punjabi. And the other major poets of this tradition are Hafiz Barkhurdar with his classic Yusuf Julekha, Hasim Shah, Ahmad Yar, Imam Baksh, and others. So in the Sufi tradition, there are, and the Kissa tradition, although they run the parallel, but we have the Sufi tradition, which is more concerned or having more impact on the literature. Sheikh Farid, who is, we may presume that the Punjabi literature begin with the poetry of Farid, Sheikh Farid, who composed sloks, hymns included in the Guru Granth Sahib. Then, when we try to read about the Farid, this is the parallel poetry of
Gurveer Singh Ji, can you finish in 2 minutes?
Yeah. I'm just coming with
Sure,
3 or 4 minutes. I'm coming to it.
Absolutely.
When we say about the Farid, that he is, I think I'm the only one who suffers from top of the house. I find every house on fire. I may read it couplet in the Punjabi, or it is in the translation. Frida मैं जानिया दुख मुझको दुख सुभाए जग उच्चे चढ़ के देखिया कर कर एक आग. Then there is Guru Nanak, and thereafter all the tradition of the Guru Nanak Sahib and Guru Granth Sahib, and that is Guru Gobind Singh, and thereafter Sufi poetry. And now I am coming to the present, which is in the now, after the independence day. We may talk about the literature written from the modern age, that is from Fourteenth Singh, and he was the torchbearer for the humankind, for the society, for the new trends in the society, in the literature. Then after Fourteenth Singh, then there is Taniram Chatra, Mohan Singh Dewana, Professor Mohan Singh, and Darshan Singh Awara, Devendra Satyarthi. Then again coming to the woman folk, that start from the Amrita Pritam, and Amrita Pritam is a highly talented woman poet with a fine sensibility, who along with Mohan Singh represent the modern era of Punjabi poetry. Then there is Dr. Harbhajan Singh, and now coming to the fiction, although Sant Singh Sekhon, I may say about Shiv Kumar Batalvi, who is also one of the classics of the poetry in Punjabi. Then coming to women, Amrita Pritam and Dilip Kaur Tiwana and the madam Ajit Kaur. For her, we may say that she, about the short stories, and for the last 4 or 5 decades, she is doing her best in the Punjabi language for that. Now, then there comes the Naxal movement in the Punjabi. There, Dr. Jagtar, Pash, Surjit Patar. Thereafter, in these stories, we may say Vrayam Singh Sandhu, Gurbachan Pullar, and the new trends after the Blue Star and the 84 Rights, that is the new type of poetry, maybe of Sukhvinder Amrit, Jaswant Jaffar, and some others, Vijay Vivek, Gurtej Koharwala, and the new story trends, that is Jitinder Haas. And moreover, one of that who has in the next line, and thereafter, that is the Vrayam Sandhu. That contemporary literature, Vrayam Sandhu, when he writes about the present situation and the Naxal and the village folk, that creates impact on the society.
Thank you.
So if we say about the things and the Punjabi literature, the contemporary literature, which is up to the mark with the international trends. So we have to see this aspect of the Punjabi trend in the context of the international and national, and that is keeping up to the mark for that.
Thank
So
you.
my view about that is our literature is parallel, just having the importance and also meaningful for the folks. I
Thank
wish I have the opportunity to say something in a very brief about the literature, because now it was a topic which has the vast period. I may not have doing something for others.
Gurveer Singh ji,
Yes,
I think
again, thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Definitely next time we meet in Delhi, I hope I can see you. I'll learn more from you, particularly
Thank
the
you.
second part of your
Welcome,
presentation
welcome.
about Punjabi literature is something that we don't know very much. I know, Professor, some people that you have mentioned, I've read some of them, but I would like to hear more in depth. You talk about all those people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me invite the next speaker. Is she Raksanda Jalil who will be speaking?
Raksanda Jalil is much presented. She's much present. Yeah.
Oh, she is here. Okay. Raksanda Jalil, right? Can I invite you to give your presentation now?
Certainly. Thank you.
And if you can do it in 13-14 minutes, that would be really great.
I have a long paper, and this is part of an ongoing work on
Sure.
how partition has been viewed on Urdu literature as Batwara and as Azadi. Now, because it's a long paper, it has an argument, but I'm willing to stop at 13 to 14 minutes if
Okay, sure.
somebody
Thank
can indication. I'll try and wrap it up as much as I can.
Sure.
My paper is called Batwara versus Azadi, two versions of a cataclysm. This is part of an ongoing work. So there are arguments that are still being fleshed out, and it builds on older work where I've been looking at partition in Urdu literature. My area of work has been Urdu, and I look at Urdu, but I write in English. Just as there was no uniform, unvariegated, one-dimensional reflection in contemporary Urdu literature to the revolt of 1857, there is no generalized or undifferentiated response to the partition among the Muslim intelligentsia. The Urdu literature of the partition years, which it must be stressed, was written by both Muslim and non-Muslim writers, both in India and what later became Pakistan. I'm not talking of Bangladesh at this point because my area of work is mostly up till the 50s. So I will be talking about India and Pakistan in the context of this paper. It reflects a bewildering and often contradictory array of opinions. The Muslim response is equally, if not more, bewildering and contradictory. Taken together, the Urdu literature of this period, which comprised the novel and short story. It must be pointed out that the short story in particular flowered rather spectacularly during this period, as well as poetry, reportage, autobiography, diary, journal writing, and journalistic writings present a broad spectrum of opinion. Reactions vary from nostalgic lament for a lost age to attaching blame and apportioning responsibility for the terrible misfortunes that had before been affected in some way or the other by partition. While there is a general agreement that the murder and mayhem that accompanied the partition was a human tragedy of epic proportions, there is far more ambivalence in the ways of dealing or accepting the consequences of partition. A study of Urdu literature of this period, and I mean right up till the early 50s, when I'm looking at partition literature, I'm not going beyond the early 50s, even though I see later incidents of communal violence and other things that continue to happen in India as a consequence of partition. But for the purpose of this paper, I'm limiting myself to the early 50s. A study of Urdu literature of this period also reveals a wide range of possible reasons why some chose to stay put, while others migrated. Often economic reasons predominate over religious reasons, and pragmatism supersedes ideology. while the majority of writers made a conscious effort to hold up the tattered fabric of secularism in the face of communalism, bitter and painful memories also find expression, especially in a range of first-person accounts, diaries, reportages, etc. I have in mind things like Fikr Toswi's Chhata Darya. The land of five rivers becomes a land of six rivers, where the sixth river is the river of blood. One is unable to discern a commonality of concerns, nor any coherence and unity of thought, save the obvious assertion that countless innocent lives were lost due to the political decisions of a mere handful. Also, I don't have the time to elaborate on this in these 13 minutes, but I don't see a very nuanced intellectual approach. There's a lot of chest beating, there's a lot of talk of consequences, but there's very little dwelling on reasons. I don't find very many Urdu writers of this period. I think it is left to the professional historian to look for reasons. By and large, there is not a very intellectual or a very nuanced response to partition, I find, in the multiplicity of texts that I look at. I'm going to jump quite a few things. Then I talk about Taqsim ya Batwara. The word for partition in Urdu is Taqsim. Batwara is also another word commonly used in Hindustani, Hindi, Urdu. But the other thing that is talked about is Azadi. As in, there's one set of people who are saying that, it's enough to talk. Let's not look at the past. Let us look at the future. Let us talk of nation building, and let us celebrate Azadi. This is interpreted in different ways. I'm straying from my written paper because maybe there isn't enough time to read it out in all its complexity. But essentially, there are people in India, and this includes the progressive writers and those who are part of the Hindi film industry, who are interpreting the nation building project by saying things like, and why I'm including film lyricists in this is that this is a period right up till the early 50s when major Urdu poets are also writing for Hindi cinema. So you have Hindi films talking about Chodo kal ki baatein, kal ki baat purani, aao milkar likhein nayi kahani, hum Hindustani. So this, when Jawaharlal Nehru is saying, let the temples of modern India be the schools and the colleges and the dams and the factories. This idea is being interpreted by the film lyricist, by the poet, by the public intellectual, and they are all talking about how let's put our shoulder to the wheel, let us get on with the business of nation building. So you have these what seems like very Soviet-inspired songs like Sathi Haath Badhana, Sathi De, Ek Akela Thak Jayega, Milkar Saath Chalana. So you have both in the larger public mainstream cinema, as well as in the you have people in India interpreting it in this manner. Similarly, in Pakistan, we also have two sets of views, those who are looking back with a lot of nostalgia, like Intezar Hussain and others, who are looking at what they have left behind. It could be something intangible, like memories. It could be something tangible, like a neem tree that his father had planted, that is left standing in the courtyard of his ancestral Haveli somewhere in Uttar Pradesh, and he's yearning for that tree. He's yearning for the sound of the birds that used to come when his mother gave roti to the birds. So very personal, deeply, you might say small, you might say trivial images, but they are carried across the border as baggage. They are carried across the border as memories. So there are those things. But there is also another set of intellectuals in Pakistan who are saying that let us talk of Pakistaniyat, let us talk of Pakistani culture, let us talk of Pakistani adab. And they are saying that, and these are the ones who are saying, let's celebrate Azadi. Let us not constantly dwell back on the imagined glories that we have left behind, or the real glories for that matter. Let us not look at that, but let us instead look at building a nation together. In the context of in the context of freedom, also there is two sets of, why just two, actually multiple sets of responses. The progressives who belong to the Progressive Writers Association, the Progressive Writers Movement, many of them who are staunch communists believe that the freedom that has come after a long struggle is a false freedom, because that is the position taken by the Communist Party, that this freedom is not the freedom that we wanted. This is a false freedom, therefore. And Faiz Ahmad Faiz, in his very famous this night bitten dawn, this ye wo seher to nahi tha intezar jiska. So there is among one set of intellectuals, writers, thinkers, also this feeling that this is not the freedom that we had hoped for. How much time do I have? Can I conclude, or may I read?
You can speak for 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay, then I'll just read my concluding. Partition generation of writers in India, such as Fikr Tausvi, Tajdar Samri, Ibrahim Jalis, and Upendranath Ashk, much of their work is personal and cathartic. A compulsive scraping of wounds, a cataloguing of unimaginable horrors, and a depiction of a sick, momentarily depraved society is often the creative writer's only way of exercising the evil within. And here again, you see the Manto generation and the generation that is writing in the years before 47 are often saying, we are all right, you and us are all right. It is the British who came along and who caused all this. So they have a very formulaic approach to the partition, saying that, you know, it was a moment of madness that seized us and it was brought on by forces outside. But then there's another generation of writers that says that no, the evil is actually within us. So you have Krishan Chandra writing a novel called Ghaddar, Traitor, and he says it is up to us whether we give in to that evil which is inside us, because we are human and human beings are tainted with evil, or we can allow ourselves to excise that evil, to remove that evil. So again, as I maintain all through in this paper, there is no one single uniform, unvariegated response. There are multiple responses, multiple voices. It served the needs of its times in a rough and ready sort of way, the literature that came out immediately in 47, but it was patchy, uneven, often incoherent. Much of it falls under what has been termed Waqti Adab. Not all, I'm saying. Of course, there is great literature that has come out of partition that rises above its time and circumstance and continues to speak to us. But if you see the big spectrum of responses, there is a fair amount of literature that we can call Waqti Adab. It's like a knee-jerk response, जिसको हम उर्दू में कहते हैं घुटने की चोट. आपको जब घुटने पे चोट लगती है तो आप चीख पड़ते हैं क्योंकि वो बड़ी जोर से आपको चोट लगती है. तो there is no time for the partitioned, some of the partition writers to reflect, to introspect, to look for causes. Instead, they seem content to talk about the bibda, the travails, the trauma that has befallen them. Given the propensity of most writers to focus on violence and communal tensions, the Urdu critics have called these stories fasadat ke afsane, or riot literature, again serving to deflect the attention from partition per se and turning the cause and effect equation upside down. A word that crops up repeatedly in these stories is fasadat or danga, which translated as riot in English. It has an entire Indian connotation, very peculiarly Indian connotation. When used in India, a riot is more often than not a clash between two communities and is a word loaded with communal intent, unlike the English original usage. Now, so a lot of partition literature has been dubbed or categorized as fasadat ke afsane. I think this is also problematic, and we need to sort of undo some of the damage done by an earlier generation of critics and writers. I will conclude with this, even though I have various other things, but I want to stay within the time limit. History alone will decide whether we have accepted wisely and correctly. This is a quote. I'm sorry, I should have said. The quote is from Maulana Azad in India Wins Freedom. And he's saying, history alone will decide whether we have accepted wisely and correctly in accepting partition. As far as the quote closes here, as far as the Urdu writer is concerned, the jury is still out. Moreover, a lot depends on the composition of the jury. Is it a Pakistani jury or an Indian one? For on the question of state and nationhood, the Urdu writers on either side of the border seem to have little in common. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Raksanda. And I'm so impressed by what you have said. I regret that I had to rush you through this paper. I hope you come up with a longer version. Is it going to be a book length study?
No, it's at the moment an academic paper.
Okay, I wish you do a book length study. This is my request, because some of the things that you have said, I haven't heard many writers on the partition come up with that. For example, our failure to address the mayhem which resulted from the partition from an intellectual perspective. We know that we cannot really look at the face of any brute matter like genocide or fasada, that you say, which has taken increasingly a communal turn in the subcontinent. But at a distance of time, we must really look intellectually, because only then we can make sense. And once we start making senses, ways of resolutions of this crisis will offer themselves. That's my belief, maybe very naive, but as a student of literature and also history and many other subjects, we are supposed to read along with English literature. I believe that this is a solution that we can really wait for. May I now turn to Ms. Kamala Wijeratne? You have been patiently waiting for your turn, I can see that. So I'll give you once again 13, 14 minutes. So please speak, and let's see whether you are audible. And once we see that you are audible, please continue.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Padma Shri Ajitji and Dr. Rao of the Sahitya Academy for inviting me to do this presentation. Ajitji has been very generous to me. She has always showered her blessings on me as a writer. So Professor Mansurul Islam, I have titled the paper, Our Cultures, Our Literatures. It's important to call it literatures rather than literature. Literature we have on stone and pillar, on ola leaf and papyrus, literature of the tongue and of the book, literature written down and not written down, literature passed down from generation to generation. We are all heirs of those literatures. The word literatures is most relevant to Sri Lanka, which is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious, and multicultural entity. Ethnic-wise, there are the literatures of the Sinhalese, of the Tamils, of those who practice Islam, as well as of the Burghers. There are the literatures lesser known of the Adivasi Vaddas and of the Malays. There are literatures created and nurtured by the belief system, by the Buddhists, by the Hindus, by the Muslims, and the Christians. There are literatures distinguished by the medium in which they write, Sinhala, Tamil, and English. There are literatures distinguished by region as well. The literature of the South, written in Sinhala, varies from the literature of the Northwestern and the Central. Literatures written in Tamil vary from those written in the North and from the East. So, literatures rather than literature. Since discussion of all these literatures in their innumerable variety and range cannot be done justice to in a paper of this nature, I will deal only with the literatures I am most familiar with, and that is the Sinhala literature and the literature written in recent times in English. The doyen of Sri Lankan historians and archaeologists, Dr. Sparanavitana, traces the earliest literature of the Sinhala to the 1st century BC. As with all literatures of humankind, the earliest literatures were religious scripts. According to Parnamitana, I unquote, the earliest literature was a Theravada canon in the Pali language brought to Ceylon by Mahinda and his companions, handed down at first orally by different schools of literatures of various collections to which it was subdivided. These scriptures were written down in the 4th century BC. The preservation of the Theravada canon, which had been lost in India itself at a comparatively early date, is the greatest contribution that the Sinhalese people have made to the intellectual heritage of mankind. To quote the archaeologists fully, a considerable literature in old Sinhalese had grown around the canon, consisting of exegetical texts, religious legends, and historical accounts pertaining both to India as well as to the island Sri Lanka. Parnamitana observes that not a vestige of that literature is left today, but he points out that it provided material for the commentarial literature in Pali and the chronicles written in that language, written in the 5th century. He refers to the literature on stone, the inscriptions. The inscriptions of the period are generally a matter of fact style, but there are a few documents, the earliest of which may be as old as the 2nd century BC, which indicates that the Sinhala language had been used for literary purposes, and there was poetry written on it from the earliest period of its separate existence. In fact, the modern Facebook has its history in Sri Lanka in the rocks graffiti written on the Sigiriya rock on the mirror wall. In the earliest era of recorded history, it's clear that both Pali and Sinhala were used to creating and recording literature. The best example is the work of Buddhaghosa, an astute Brahmin from India who had accepted Buddhism and become a convert. Having mastered the Tripitaka, that engaged himself in writing explanatory treatises. He was aware that the interpretation of the Pali scriptures had been best preserved in Ceylon, and he should gain a knowledge of them if he would complete the work that he had addressed himself to. By coming to Sri Lanka, Buddhaghosa visited Ceylon, addressed himself to the task, and returned to India. His commentarial work has settled the doctrines of Sinhala Buddhism for the generations after him, and is held as authoritative in all the lands of Theravada Buddhism. Buddhist scriptures, the Tripitaka, and its commentaries created much literary activity in the late Anuradha period, as suggested by the description in History of Ceylon, edited by Professor H.C. Rai. Buddhaghosa and his colleagues were followed by numerous other scholars. The general scholarship was in Pali, but it is evident that Sanskrit was also studied by scholars. The flowering of this Sanskrit tradition is in the Janaki Harana, attributed to Kumaradasa of the 13th century, whose name is associated with the great Indian Sanskrit scholar Kalidasa. It is clear in the early era of the Anuradhapura period and the late Anuradhapura period, 300 BC to 1505 CE, were eras of much cultural, art, architecture, and literature, intercommunication, and exchange between India and Sri Lanka. Every literary movement in India affected the literary movements in Sri Lanka. For example, the Mahakavi tradition in India generated a similar movement in Sri Lanka. The Momadevtavata and the Sasadavata are the best examples. However, the Sri Lankan or the Ceylonese creations were no imitations. They were recreations of the Indian models, for they were fashioned according to the Buddhist framework and incorporated the Buddhist concepts. They either illustrated the character or personality of the Buddha and his virtues, or exemplified the main tenets of Buddhism. The Mohavadevata reflects the commentaries which were written mostly in Pali. The most noteworthy work of this period was the Mahavamsa, which Dr. Paranavitana describes as going back to about 1,000 years, attributed to a Mahanama. To quote the historian, unquote, Mahanama was the author of a Pali work which, judged as literature, is far superior to any of the Pali works so far passed in history. In addition to its being the principal source of our information for the early history of Ceylon, it is also a poem of no mean merit. Close quotes. History, the personality and culture of the rulers, their attitude to Buddhism, schisms within the Sasana, the order of monks, and other social economic factors affected the practice of literature. For about 6 centuries, literary works were in abeyance. Intermittently, prose works in the form of commentaries flourished. The flowering of literature often depended on royal or political patronage. For more than 1,000 years, Sri Lankan culture and literature were linked with those of India. Great literary movements in Sri Lanka were the fruits of Indian innovations. For example, as I have cited, the Mahakavi tradition, the Champukavi tradition too affected Sri Lanka. At a later period, the Sandesa Kavya created in India also had its flowering in Sri Lanka. Literary traditions were not linear or regular. Political movements and stability influenced the blossoming of literature. Royal patronage was a key factor, and Sinhala literature, whatever its influence was, always reformulated and reinterpreted within the framework of Buddhist concepts, and the didactic objective was never forgotten. Although for nearly 2 millennia, Pali, Sinhala, and sometimes Sanskrit were the media of the writers, foreign invasions, particularly the occupation of the island by the Europeans, changed the course of literature. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British subsequently overran the island. No literature of any worth arose in Portuguese or Dutch, but English has taken deep root in Sri Lanka. Entering Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, in 1796, the English managed to consolidate their power in 1815 all over the island. The language of administration, of judiciary, and education became English. As a result, a literature in English has grown alongside the literatures in Sinhala and Tamil. For the first 100 years, from 1796 to 1896, no literary of great merit is noticeable in English. But the turn of the century saw Englishmen writing both poetry and prose. Leonard Wool's Village in the Jungle, W.S. Senior's The Song of Lanka are classic examples. English writers were soon followed by the burghers, who held themselves heirs of the British. Writers like Carl Muller, W.S. Crowther, Jean Arasanayagam, and others soon followed. Along with them, the English educated elite, both Sinhala and Tamil, chose English as their medium. Literature in English has come to stay, as evidenced by the winning of the Booker Prize 2022 by a Sri Lankan, Sihan Karunatilaka. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation summing up the two cultures you are talking about and other literatures you are talking about. Seems to be a continuity, as a matter of fact, not ruptures. It's my turn, but I don't have much time. I rather like to talk not from a written paper, but from ideas that I have in my head as I listened to the three presentations.
If you
I see
give-
the crisis which
okay,
is engulfing us now,
Manzurul,
particularly,
Manzurul, if you
yes,
take 5-10 minutes more, it does not matter because the next session is the last session of the day. Don't worry.
is the last
Really?
session.
No,
Yes, no, I know, but I have a class I have to attend at 5 o'clock. So that's the problem. I have to rush. So anyway, but when I meet in Delhi, I'll come up with a regular paper. And I had something ready, but I did not have the time to complete this paper. But this is forming in my head. But let's talk about the crisis that we are talking about. And let me tell you how I look at the crisis. I take a shorter view and the longer view. The longer view of the crisis is as old as civilization itself. But there have been poets and writers who have warned us of the coming of the crisis in many forms. It's our shorter view which is clouded by contemporary developments. We somehow cannot go beyond the contemporary nature of our developments, of the crisis. So we are engulfed today, for example, with whatever is happening in Europe, the war which is raging. And in any war, the first victims are the children and the women. And not to speak of the soldiers, some of them are very young. So no war makes any sense, but the wars are the creation of people of power. And I'll mention two poets from Bangladesh who could foresee the crisis coming. One was Rabindranath Tagore, as they call him Tagore in many places. In Bangla, we call him Thakur. Now, Rabindranath Tagore knew about the coming of a crisis because he could see at the beginning of the 20th century, one or two developments which preceded whatever was going to happen in the future. By the turn of the century, he produced a book of poems called Noibeddo, or offerings. And these offerings were spiritual and aesthetic. But increasingly, he felt that these offerings will sound hollow if people are not willing to receive them. He could see the developments happening in South Africa, the Boer War, the Irish Civil War brewing, and then the coming of the First World War. And he could quickly identify three sources of the crisis. One was nationalism, which in its modern form is immensely destructive. He could also see rivalries among nations. For no reason, the European continent was divided into camps, each one bent upon destroying the other, forgetting they were living in a common geography, many having traits of the same culture. And the third force he could see was colonization. And colonization is a brutal force which takes away not only a territory, but also people's subjectivity, identity, and their languages. And when you are bereft of your own language and identity and subjectivity, you are left with practically nothing. So he warned the world about nationalism. He gave certain lectures, a series of lectures in Europe and America on nationalism. In the beginning, the lectures drew crowds of people, 2,000 thronging the halls where he gave the speech. But then increasingly, the crowds dwindled. The very last meetings drew only 20, 30 listeners because people did not like to face the unpleasant and inconvenient truth. But Tagore did not compromise. He was a speaker of the inconvenient truth, and he liked to speak to the eye of the power. In nationalism, he suggested how our nations have become bigger than themselves. And this is a quote: "The time comes when it can stop no longer the growth of the nation," so to say, if they are fed by nationalism. For the competition grows keener, competition between nations. Organization grows vaster, and selfishness attains supremacy. trading greed and fear of man, it occupies more and more space in society and at last becomes his ruling force. So you see how rivalries among nations produce a force which becomes the ruling force. And this is exactly that brought the First World War, then the Second World War, and before that, the beginning of the Holocaust. All these were strung together. So in 1941, in failing health, but at the dictate of his own conscience, he gave a speech which is also written down and aptly described the title, gave the title, The Crisis of Civilization. There he identified the reasons why civilization was in crisis. He says, as I look around, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. That civilization of the world of which all of us were proud, because all of us were a member of the human civilization, somehow became categorized as Western, Eastern, and then the hatred and the mistrust between the two parts of the globe grew. And then we see how each part separately developed so many pockets of resistance and pockets of exercise of the same kind of blindness. Tagore believed that this crisis will teach us at least two important lessons. First, to believe in ourselves, in our inner strengths. And secondly, to look at your neighbor and find something strong and important from the neighbor to borrow. If you can go to the neighbor with our hands stretched, he wrote in one of his poems, you can always get something and you can also give something in return. And his celebration of India had been a country where great civilizations had come together and blended together, and great many races of people landed in India. They never went back. Melabe milibe jabe na fire. You will be mingling with each other, but you will never go back. It was a melting pot which invited races from all around the world. And for centuries, we learned to live together. But once again, colonizing forces from outside the continent came down and brought all the ruins. Raksanda has given a very important rejoinder in terms of our discussion of the partition literature and partition crisis. We can look at ourselves and find out why we are fighting each other. Is it some primitive force still occupying our hearts, on our conscience, blinding our conscience? Or is it something we borrow from colonizing forces from outside? I tend to believe that it is not something which has been brought from outside. Rabindranath Tagore also did not believe it has been brought from outside. It is something which is inherent. The moment we look at our neighbor as an enemy, because there has been border created between our two houses, we cease to become compassionate and caring about the neighbor. And then we are given to the forces of separation and destruction. Partition literature should tell us that enough has been already enough, that we have learned how to live together, but somehow we have also forgotten to live together. And that is the whole idea of this conference, I believe. When we speak to each other, we learn from each other, we share our thoughts. I congratulate Gurbez Singh Ji for mentioning the Sufi tradition. I also, in Bangladesh, we also have a tradition called the Baul tradition, which is very near the Sufi tradition, in which oneness with God is important, oneness with nature is another important aspect, and oneness with each other, a collective humanity, creating a humanity without any difference and rough edges. That's another important Baul tradition. And they practice a very simple lifestyle without any excesses needed to sustain the Bauls from day to day. And they move around, they do not have any fixed houses. The Bauls are the nomads of the river and the land, and they are the ones who teach you that God's great world always provides something for everyone. You don't have to crave for something. You just wait patiently for things to be delivered. That's the Baul tradition. And Rabindranath took a lot from the Baul tradition. And let me finish by referring to the other great poet we have, Qazi Nazrul Islam, who in his poems celebrated the idea that India has sustained Hindus and Muslims and other religions for centuries. And if you look at nature, you see how different aspects of life are existing in a balance. If nature can put the whole animal world, the world of flora and fauna, the world of the ecosystem that we live in, is something which is composed of fine balances everywhere. And Nazrul Islam warned us so many years ago. He was born in 1889. And so you can see how old he was, how young he was when he was going to the war, 1899, sorry. And when he was 21, he wrote some of the best of his poems. And in those poems, he warned us that please don't destroy the balance. Wars can destroy the balance, but the First World War was not our making. We did not create it, we did not want it. Let's not be driven apart by this war. And he also told his readers to look for a future where there would be no conflicts except an understanding among the people of the great nation. So with these words, let us conclude our seminar today. Ajit ji, I know that you expected me to have a written paper, but I'll bring the written paper when we meet next in Delhi. I promise you that. And I am looking forward to listening to Kamala ji again. And Raksanda, please finish this as a book-length study. I'll be one of the first to buy the books. And partition literature, although we have not been affected as severely as the Western border people have been affected, but still, when your neighbors leave en masse and go to the next country to settle, they leave behind an emptiness, which is not simply theirs, but your emptiness as well. And we have learned to live with the emptinesses left behind by our neighbors. I grew up in a small town where a lot of people left after 1947, and my mother regretted losing her friends for no reason. That's what my mother believed the partition to be. Taking away her friends and neighbors for no good reason. And that is something we are looking at. But we have to accept reality. We really cannot be too nostalgic, although you talked about nostalgia. We have to really look forward and see how best we can mend things and how best the partition memories can turn from the inherently sad and melancholic to something through which we can revive ourselves. So Gurbez Singh ji, I would like to meet you and then listen from you about Punjabi literature and maybe some readings. And
Thank you. You are welcome. Thank you, smart ladders, to have such a comments from your workshop. We really hope to meet together next time.
Thank you very much. Ajit ji, if you allow me to go, I'll go now. And to everyone, goodbye. And Raj Mohan ji, did I play a good chair today?
Yeah, this is Suresh Babu. Okay, I'm not Raj Mohan,
okay,
but
not
still,
Raj Mohan, sorry.
in fact, I'm about to comment on that only, Syed Manjurul Islam ji, because when you are presenting your paper and when you're commenting on Rakshanda Jalil ji's partition literature and other things, even Sufism of Gurbez Singh Guria ji, I was remembered by the great mathematician Archimedes. Archimedes once he said that give me a point of support, I shall move this year.
Mm.
So who is supposed to give that point of support? Because you rightly said that the very Sark, the very ideology behind the Sark post-fall meeting is to bring all the what you call people together and to make them unite and to bring that humanity and everything together. So even I was, I was remembered by the Coleridge in his one of his statements. He said that beauty never lies in the object; it all lies in the beholder. So, the way you see, the same way the object is going to be reflected. It doesn't mean that beauty lies in object. I think all of us do agree with me. So, in that perception, as Syed Manjurul Islam Sahab has rightly pointed out, that yeah, we are for the better cause. In fact, the very literature is for a better noble cause. So, thank you so much, Syed Manjurul Islam ji, for wonderfully chair this session, and congratulations to all the paper presenters, right from Dr. Gurbez Singh Guria ji. और मुबारक का क्योंकि आज गुरुपुरब की होने के बाद भी आप you could spare your time in spite of the festive mood, and Miss Rakshanda Jalil ji from India, and Miss Kamala Vijayaratne ji from Sri Lanka, and of course Syed Manjurul Islam Sahab from Bangladesh, and my special thanks to Professor Ajit Kaurji for all her commitment and time and again I say, because it is a source of inspiration to many to follow. So thank you so much, ma'am. I sincerely thank all of you on behalf of Dr. K. Srinivasa Rao ji, Secretary Sahitya Academy, as well as Ajit Kaur ma'am, President Postfall, for sparing your valuable time with us. With this, session has come to end, and I sincerely thank all the viewers for listening and seeing this same. Thank you very much. Jai.